see, and so that sets me in competition with you. But if I was indigenous, even, I would probably say that actually the sense of man's superiority to nature is probably part of that problem, right? So we have to really approach it from a whole host of different angles, and that sort of indigenous wisdom and native wisdom is probably just as important.
Now, it's interesting you're talking about this conversation that's going on about, is there a better way of doing these things, in a way? And James, let me bring you in on this, because obviously, in the United States, that is the home in many ways of the capitalist way of doing things. But even there is a...
I think Scotland is the home of capitalism.
Depends which
That's where it came from.
Depends which history books you read, I suppose. But, and indeed who's written them, I guess. The Scots have written a lot of history after all. Where you are, this conversation is going on as well, isn't it? About, is there a better way of processing things that doesn't necessarily, as Eliza was said mean using people as objects rather than humans?
Well, certainly if you look at the campaign of Bernie Sanders, who is a self-described socialist, which I know in Europe that's not a very big deal, but in the United States it's very rare that you ever have any politician call themselves that. And he obviously did very well in the Democratic primary. He didn't win, but I believe he's now ranked as one of the most, if not the most popular politician in America, which is quite something for a man of his age who's been around for so long. So clearly there's something in the air. I wouldn't say that there's a real movement to, overturn capitalism and replace it with something. But, is there disillusionment with the economic system that we've had and with free trade in particular? Absolutely, yes.
Well, in a way, it goes back to what we were saying earlier about the sense of the markets doing really, really well, but that not pervading throughout society, people not feeling at certain levels that they're benefiting from it. James, I mean, that's part of what maybe drove some of the fuel to the Trump presidency, perversely.
It is, and but I would just caution that I think there's a lot of maybe lack of historical memory or lack of knowledge about other parts of the world. I think as bad as things might be now, they've been a lot worse, certainly in American history. If you look at socialist economies and the way that they've performed, it's a pretty dreary picture everywhere. So I would just, caution people. Obviously we can do things to attenuate some of the harsher consequences of capitalism. But, a country like Sweden, or the Scandinavian countries, which are often pointed to, those are capitalist societies. They have strong social welfare states, but they're not socialist state-run economies.
No, certainly. And the experience of that, Eliza, in Africa, the experience of socialist state-run economies was not a happy one, in the 70s and 80s, was it?
No, but I'm not arguing for socialism either, right? And this is what I think, that there is a space that we need to move into, where we're thinking about what, that why is there this sort of dichotomy, or it's either capitalism or communism or capitalism or socialism, that we need to be thinking far more creatively about what needs to replace the systems that we have. And I think, I would sort of push back on what James has said, only in as far as that there were darker times in America. I think if you're an African American or a Native American, you might not agree with that sentiment.
You might think it's pretty bad at the moment.
Or that it has been bad for a long time. And that perhaps, now, if we talk about sort of comforts and GDP per head going up, of course, people have access to water and basic services. But when we talk about structural issues, that game has always been rigged. And when we talk about the free market, laissez-faire has never been laissez-faire. It takes a lot of government intervention to run our laissez-faire.
There's no such thing as a completely free market.
Oh, absolutely not.
So, James, you wanted to come back, I think, on that one.
Oh, well, I think it's been a lot worse for African Americans and Native Americans, certainly. If you go back to the 50s, where they didn't even have voting rights. And I actually think that capitalism has been a force to help minority communities, able to start businesses, able to earn their own capital, so that they can, grow their communities and have the same freedom that other Americans have. I think you'd find lots of African American businessmen, people in the private sector, who've been able to become more empowered and to gain more political power as well because of capitalism. So I think it's a more complicated picture.
Eliza looking very skeptical about that.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of causality, whether or not it was capitalism that has enabled, people. I think we have to ask ourselves a fundamental question about what kind of society do we want to build. And at the moment, if we continue with the capitalism that we have, then we have a capitalism that pollutes and a capitalism that leads to demeaning, mindless jobs, and one which promotes, competition over collaboration. And I don't necessarily think that that there are no lessons to be learned from other ways of organizing societies, and we really need to challenge ourselves and growth, the great myth of growth, the great myth of consumption, that we can solve all our problems if we just keep consuming, or if our economies just keep growing, that we just know that's not to be true.
So you're really talking and appealing for further thought, really, about where economics goes and how it's organized.
Absolutely.
We can leave with that theme. Thanks very much indeed to both of you on that. Let's bring ourselves up to date with the Business Matters headlines now with Sue Montgomery.
Britain's Prime Minister Theresa May has made fresh promises to European Union citizens that it will be as easy as possible to stay living in the UK after Brexit. Mrs May made the remarks in an open letter released in advance of an address to fellow EU heads of government in Brussels. The US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson has set out a vision to strengthen ties with India over the next century. Mr. Tillerson drew a direct comparison between India and its Asian rival China. He said Beijing sometimes acted outside international conventions, citing its actions in the South China Sea. German scientists have recorded an alarming decline in the population of flying insects over the past 30 years. The study showed a loss of more than 3/4 of the total biomass of flying insects, including butterflies, bees and moths.
Sue, thanks very much. Now it's that moment in the programme where we link up with one of our reporters. Today it's the BBC correspondent in Jakarta, Rebecca Henschke. Rebecca, now we know there's been quite a lot of coverage of the revelations from some documents about how much America knew about the mass killings that went on in Indonesia in the early 1960s. I presume that's created quite a stir in Indonesia as well.
It has indeed. I mean, these documents are really significant from Indonesia, although you might say it's not surprising that at the height of the Cold War, America would keep quiet about a purge of suspected communists. But for Indonesia, these documents are highly significant. For 50 years, even speaking about this period or the fact that there were mass killings was taboo. Mass graves have never been allowed to be dug up. A seminar last month that tried to talk about the killings was shut down just around the corner from my house with violent demonstrations, and the place turned into, a riot police sort of standoff between the two groups. So these documents now are being poured over. Trending topic on Twitter, particularly young Indonesians really hungry for some kind of other version of history than the one that they were taught through government propaganda in schools for the whole period of the Suharto regime and up until very recently in schools.
And there's one interesting aspect of this is the reasons, or suggested reasons perhaps, why the Americans kept quiet at the time. And there was huge killings going on. It was, perhaps explained to people who don't know, there was apparently an attempted communist coup which was then suppressed, and Communist Party members or people associated were killed in very large numbers. But part of the reason the Americans maybe kept quiet was because they had a lot of business interests.
Oh, yes. I mean, Sukarno at that time was no friend of the United States. He famously made the statement, "Go to hell with your aid, America." And he was moving very much closer in terms of economic ties with China and Africa. And we had that historic meeting between Asia-Africa meeting that Sukarno pushed. And Americans were very worried about that, whereas when General Suharto came in, he was the general that led that purge of communists. We're talking about 500,000 to up to 3 million people being killed within just a year. And he had a much more pro-business policy. He was very much open to America. And we saw a period of 32 years under his rule where American businesses did very well in Indonesia. The Freeport mine in Papua became Indonesia's largest taxpayer, that linked to an American mining company, gold and copper there. huge logging and in Kalimantan and also other minerals there. So there was a definite gain economically from the United States from General Suharto's long 32-year rule. Though towards the end they soured on it and started to promote the democratic movement, but economically it was a very good deal for them to stay quiet on these mass killings.
Now, Rebecca, briefly also, I know you're working on a story about a change in the law that seems to be coming in, affecting the LGBT community in Indonesia.
Yeah, this is particularly to do with advertising business here and also television programs. For a long time in Indonesia, waria or transgender people have been used in advertising to sell products, often in a humorous way, a very kind of flirty way, and it works to sell products. It's part of the culture here, but there's been growing anti-LGBT sentiment. Indonesians, I guess, reacting in a way to the gains that the communities had in other parts of the world, as well as growing religious conservatism here. And now we've seen a draft of a law that's been put forward that would see a banning of any form of LGBT kind of style in advertising or on television. And already we're getting reports that television stations who are doing those sort of programs or advertisements are quietly getting calls to tone it down.
All right. Well, Rebecca, thanks very much indeed. We'll look forward to hearing more about that story as well. Rebecca Henschke there live on the line from Jakarta. And James, briefly, I know you've got an interest in this kind of thing that's happening. We heard there about the apparent squeezing out of the LGBT community from some media areas.
It's really unfortunate. I mean, the country has long had the reputation of being the world's biggest Muslim democracy, and so this is not a very positive news story to come out. It's certainly trampling on free speech rights if you're going to ban an entire, group of people from even appearing in advertising.
It's a very worrying development. Now, you may have had a hard day, but spare a thought for the 2,287 delegates at the 19th Communist Party Congress in the Great Hall of the People in Beijing. On Wednesday, they heard a speech from the party chairman and president of China, Xi Jinping. It began like this.
中国共产党第19次全国代表大会
And 205 minutes later, that is 3 hours and 25 minutes later, he sat down again. Now, even his predecessor, Hu Jintao, was tapping his watch at that stage. But Mr. Xi is terse and to the point compared to some. The late Hugo Chavez, president of Venezuela, once spoke for 8 hours. Fidel Castro of Cuba managed only a mere 7.5. So, is brevity really the soul of oratory, as well as wit? I've been speaking to the screenwriter and producer and former speechwriter for Vice President Al Gore, Eli Atty. Is a 3-hour speech ever justified?
I don't think so. I think this is kind of the definition of a captive audience. And the reason you see these kinds of speeches generally in communist countries, Castro was known to give a few multi-hour stem winders. In fact, sometimes he would speak for 1 or 2 hours in answer to a single question, is because the crowd can't go anywhere. If brevity is the soul of wit, I think you can conclude that there's never been a witty 3.5-hour speech.
Okay, so what's the perfect length for a political speech then?
8 minutes, 12 minutes. There's very little that you can say of any value that needs even 45 minutes or an hour.
Yeah, I mean, you think Gettysburg Address, of course, don't you?
Yes, exactly. And it's funny because in this country, the longest inaugural address was William Henry Harrison in 1841. He spoke for 1 hour and 45 minutes in a howling snowstorm, came down with pneumonia, and died a month later. I think there was some kind of speech-making karma at play there.
Okay, so you say 8 to 12...
And it's funny.
You say 8 to 12 minutes. I mean, you'd have to work pretty hard to get a lot of political messages into that, wouldn't you?
It's only vanity. It's wanting to kind of explain yourself more and to cram more points in than really anybody can remember that makes these speeches so long. And, as a politician, certainly in a democracy, you're trying to connect with your audience. You're trying to move your audience. Keeping them sitting still for an hour. I wrote a speech for New York Mayor David Dinkins when he conceded the election to Rudy Giuliani. I wrote a speech for Congressman Dick Gephardt when he handed the gavel to Newt Gingrich after 40 years of Democratic rule of the House. And the reason I think those speeches were effective is that they were quite short. There was no agenda that was being advanced. They were just sort of graceful statements of that moment in democracy. And to some degree, the less of a burden you have on the speech, the better it is. I worked on a number of State of the Union addresses when I worked in the Clinton White House, and, they tend to, there's 800 policies that you're trying to describe and sell, and it just kind of, weighs everything down. When Andy Warhol, the pop artist, was managing the rock band The Velvet Underground, their goal was to antagonize, and Andy Warhol always told them, leave the audience wanting less. I think the principle in speechwriting is the opposite. You want to step off the stage and have people hungering for more, so they'll vote for you, so they'll ratify your agenda. I think you can wear an audience out to the point of annoyance and hostility. Never a good thing.
Eli Atty there, leaving us wanting more, definitely. Eliza, you give speeches occasionally, I'm guessing, don't you?
Very occasionally.
Short ones?
After today's advice, definitely.
Come on, normally, how long is your speech? Come on, confession time.
Oh, yeah, short speeches. Never more than 10 minutes.
A few good jokes.
Yes, perhaps a little poetry.
Yes, sprinkle it in.
I started one actually in Barcelona earlier in the year with a song. I sang some Nina Simone. I was very nervous, so I thought if I start by singing, then they'll just take pity and not pay attention to what I've actually said.
Probably wouldn't work at the Chinese Communist Party Congress, I'm guessing. Now, James, you're probably someone who has to sit through a fair few speeches, aren't you?
Certainly, and there are some politicians who I wouldn't mind sitting through their talks. I mean, Boris Johnson comes to mind. Okay. He's amusing. I don't necessarily agree with everything he says, obviously, but he can tell a joke.
He says it well.
He says it well.
Yes, yeah.
And I covered his when he first ran for mayor. I remember covering him. I went to London and he walked into Smithfield's, the butchery. Yeah. And he said, they want a shot of me with the Caucasus. And so he took a photo with these two giant slabs of meat, hanging from the ceiling. So, he's amusing. But there aren't many other politicians, I have to say, who I would sit for hours.
Well, let me pay that back to you and say, what about Donald Trump? Now, you may not want to hear what he says, but when he says it, people listen, don't they?
I think maybe the 10th time we heard, we're going to build the wall. It's going to be the greatest wall. Mexico's going to pay for. I can give you his routine because we hear it every other day. It's the same jokes. It's the same lines.
So it's not working as well.
It's getting kind of old. And it's not even a year into it yet, frankly.
All right. Eliza, who's your favorite person to listen to speaking then? In speech making.
Would it be cruel to say Theresa May? She was coughing through her speech. I thought,
awful. At least it wasn't that long. It wasn't 3 hours.
This is true. But even the set couldn't take it any longer and started to fall apart.
Imagine if that had happened in the Great Hall of the People. How bad things would have been at that point if
she wouldn't have survived.
It wouldn't have gone down well at all. So come on, what are the principles of speech making? Just, James, if you're going to give a speech, what sort of duration and how are you going to throw it? What's your style?
And I wouldn't go more than 20 minutes. And you do have to have some brevity. You do want to have a joke or two here and there. And you need to keep people's attention. I think one of the worst feelings you can get as a speaker is when people start whipping out their phones and start looking at Twitter or Instagram or Facebook.
Then you've lost them. Yep. Eliza, songs are the answer?
Yes, but no, I would say candor.
Candor, all right, okay. Candor and brevity and perhaps an occasional song. You get that with Business Matters, of course, all the time. But anyway, my thanks very much to Eliza, my thanks to James, my thanks to all of you. I hope we haven't outstayed our welcome. Bye-bye.
This is the BBC World Service, where we have set the challenge of finding ways to end sexual harassment and improve safety on public transport.
100 women on the BBC World Service.
It is our problem, it's not our fault. It's actually too late that you had to have that experience.
One of the things that the women on this panel are going to be able to do is tinker with that bus.
I wonder whether there is that emergency stop. Should we all just press the button?
Catch up with the latest at bbcworldservice.com/100women. You're listening to the BBC World Service.
Our Latin America online editor is Vanessa Bushluter, and she is...
Let's speak now to our Moscow correspondent Steve Rosenberg. And Steve,
our correspondent Bethany Bell has been following the UN talks.
Our South America correspondent Katie Watson spoke to us from Sao Paulo.
At bbcworldservice.com. This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Hello, at 1 o'clock GMT, welcome to the newsroom from the BBC World Service. I'm Ben Bland. Did President Trump speak to the widow of a dead soldier in a disrespectful way? It's the latest row involving the US president.
I did not say what she said. I had a very nice conversation with the woman, with the wife, who sounded like a lovely woman. Did not say what the congresswoman said.
Election campaigning has been suspended in Argentina after a body thought to be that of a missing activist was found. Also on the programme.
Almost as far as the eye could see, left and right, a tide of humanity. Between 10 and 15,000 people had crossed the border in one night.
A humanitarian crisis that's rapidly getting worse. The Rohingya Muslims left stranded after fleeing Myanmar. The second part of Nelson Mandela's autobiography has been published, and we'll have more on the Canadian rock legend whose death prompted an emotional prime ministerial tribute. You're listening to the BBC World Service.
I'm Stuart McIntosh with the BBC News. Hello. President Donald Trump is at the centre of a deepening controversy involving his comments to a widow of a US soldier killed in action in Niger. The mother of the soldier, Sergeant LaDavid Johnson, has echoed remarks by a Democratic congresswoman claiming that President Trump treated the widow with a lack of respect. From Washington, here's John Sopel.
The call from the White House came up on a car speakerphone as the family waited to receive the coffin of the fallen serviceman at Miami International Airport. In the vehicle was Democratic Congresswoman Frederica Wilson.
He said to the wife, well, I guess he knew what he was getting into. How insensitive can you be?
According to the Congresswoman, the president left the widow in tears as he didn't even know her husband's name. Donald Trump has denied emphatically this account of the conversation.
I did not say what she said. I had a very nice conversation with the woman, with the wife, who sounded like a lovely woman. Did not say what the congresswoman said.
This issue was politicised earlier in the week when the president asserted that he had a better record of calling the families of fallen servicemen and women than his predecessors.
The US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson has set out a vision for a strategic partnership with India over the next century. Speaking ahead of a visit to South Asia, Mr. Tillerson said the US regarded India as one of the anchors of a free and open Indo-Pacific.
President Trump and Prime Minister Modi are committed, more than any other leaders before them, to building an ambitious partnership that benefits not only our two great democracies, but other sovereign nations working toward greater peace and stability. Prime Minister Modi's visit in June highlighted the many areas of cooperation that are already underway in this new area of our strategic relationship.
Mr. Tillerson also compared India with China, saying Beijing sometimes acted outside international conventions. Scientists in Germany have documented a steep decline in the population of flying insects in less than 30 years. The study showed a loss of more than 3/4 of the total biomass of flying insects, including butterflies, bees and moths. The lead researcher, Hans de Kroon, described the high rate of decline as alarming.
In the modern agricultural landscape, for insects, it's a hostile environment. It's a desert, if not worse. And the decline there has been well documented. The big surprise is that this is also happening in adjacent nature reserves, for which we thought so far that they were doing quite well. We should be far more cautious with our insects than we have been even in the recent past. What we need to do is to encourage and bring into effect all sorts of measures that we know are profitable for insects.
You're listening to the World News from the BBC. An independent expert appointed by the United Nations says the policies promoted by the International Monetary Fund undermine the UN's human rights and development goals. Presenting his report on the promotion of international democracy and equality, Alfred de Zayas told the General Assembly that the IMF tended to prioritise economic growth over human rights and the environment. Britain's Prime Minister, Theresa May, has made fresh promises to European Union citizens that it will be as easy as possible to stay living in the UK after Brexit. The remarks were released in advance of an address to fellow EU heads of government in Brussels. Kevin Connolly reports.
Theresa May is not expected to make any big new proposal in her after-dinner remarks, but to underline the quality of the financial offer made in her speech in Florence, worth around £20 billion. The EU side wants more, though. More money, as well as further movement on citizens' rights and the Irish border. Mrs May's open letter to EU citizens in Britain, promising streamlined registration procedures and consultations on how the process works, may well help to get things moving again.
The Canadian province of Quebec is to ban local public sector employees and those using public services from covering their faces, in a move critics say discriminates against Muslim women. The new law will apply to those working or attending state-funded hospitals, clinics and schools, as well as to public transport and government offices. The government says the ban is about communication and security issues. The new instalment of Nelson Mandela's autobiography, Long Walk to Freedom, has been released in South Africa. The sequel, entitled Dare Not Linger, contains material left unfinished by the former South African president before his death. He'd written 10 chapters about his time in office when he stopped working because of age and ill health. BBC News.
Hello, you're listening to The Newsroom from the BBC World Service with me, Ben Bland. The US President holds the title Commander-in-Chief, but when a soldier dies, he also becomes the Consoler-in-Chief. However, Donald Trump has been accused of lacking empathy and being disrespectful to the widow of a serviceman who was killed during an ambush in Niger 2 weeks ago. 2 accounts of the condolence call he made suggest he was insensitive, but the President disputes that. Democratic Congresswoman Frederica Wilson claims the widow of Sergeant LaDavid Johnson wept following the call, and she was with Maisha Johnson when the president phoned.
I was in the car when President Trump called. He never said the word hero. He said to the wife, well, I guess he knew what he was getting into. How insensitive can you be?
But President Trump insisted that Frederica Wilson's version was totally fabricated.
I did not say what she said, and I'd like her to make the statement again, because I did not say what she said. I had a very nice conversation with the woman, with the wife, who sounded like a lovely woman, did not say what the Congresswoman said, and most people aren't too surprised to hear that.
Now, the mother of the soldier, Kawanda Jones-Johnson, has also criticised the president and backed the Congresswoman's version of events. The White House has accused the media of being biased, but I put it to our North America reporter, Anthony Zerka, that the unfolding events could also perhaps be seen as Donald Trump's own making.
He seems to be, violating the law of holes, which is if you're in a hole, you stop digging and not make it worse. I mean, this whole story started with a question on Monday about why he hadn't contacted the families of U.S. servicemen killed in Niger and why they were in Niger to begin with. And he responded to that by accusing his predecessors of not contacting families of slain servicemen, said they didn't do it all the time. Then he brought his chief of staff and cited that his son was killed in combat, and that reporters should ask Chief of Staff John Kelly if he was contacted by Barack Obama, which set off a whole nother series of stories. And then when he eventually did contact the family member of slain serviceman LaDavid Johnson, the reports were that he may have been callous, that he may have been a little too blunt in talking with them.
And Anthony, how damaging do you think it could be for the president, given that, he's someone who wraps himself in these symbols of patriotism in the military?
Exactly. I think that's one of the reasons why this is particularly damaging, is it cuts against one of his strengths. He campaigned on his support in the military. He burnished his credentials as a firm commander-in-chief. He loved doing events with the military. He talked about how important it was to provide aid to military veterans. He criticized the Veteran Administration hospitals here in the U.S. As being rife with corruption, and he was going to change that. So he had built up this perception of himself as a pro-military politician president, and this undermines that, being accused of doing a dishonor to a U.S. A slain soldier and the family of the soldier. That hurts. It also, I think, cuts into a weakness of his, which is the perception that he can be unempathetic, that he lacks empathy. It's an unfortunate situation, and I think it somewhat reveals a certain sloppiness on the part of this administration that Donald Trump would go into this and handle the family of a slain service member without the kind of preparation necessary, because these are very delicate situations.
Anthony Zerka there. And in response to the Washington Post report, the White House says the check has been sent. White House staffer Lindsay Walters said in an email, "It is disgusting that the media is taking something which should be recognised as a generous and sincere gesture made privately by the President and using it to advance the media's biased agenda." Now, it is a large humanitarian crisis and one that keeps growing. Thousands of Rohingya refugees are spending a fourth night stranded near the border with Bangladesh. More than 500,000 Rohingya Muslims have now fled across the border, and more keep coming. Over the past 3 days, some 15,000 refugees have been stranded with limited food and water, waiting to settle somewhere safer. The BBC's Clive Myrie is in Cox's Bazar.
In the distance in Myanmar, where Rohingya villages have burned in recent weeks and the people have been driven out, there's another fire. It's ethnic cleansing, says the UN, and the purged are fleeing for their lives into neighbouring Bangladesh.
In my village, many were killed, but my son had just been born, so we have only now been able to escape. We haven't had time to name him.
What's going on in Myanmar? Why have you had to flee? Another man we came across spoke of violence and murder.
On the way, we saw many dead people, their heads and limbs chopped off. The slaughter took place house by house.
As we drew closer to the border, nothing had prepared us for the full extent of the day's exodus. Almost as far as the eye could see, left and right, a tide of humanity. Between 10 and 15,000 people had crossed the border in one night. Young and old, hungry, exhausted, traumatized. And for the weak, it's a painful journey into exile. Many just don't have the strength to walk, including Minara Begum. She gave birth to a healthy baby boy just hours before crossing into Bangladesh. Born on a riverbank, he first opened his eyes to see a cruel world in which it seems there's no place for him or the other Rohingya Muslims. I begged God to save us, her husband Mohammed tells me. We hadn't eaten for 2 days and she went into labour. I don't know what will happen to my baby now. He's so fragile. The new arrivals could end up in one of these, the giant tented camps built in a matter of days on hillsides freshly stripped of trees. The largest will soon become the biggest refugee camp on Earth. But some have died seeking sanctuary. This week, a boat carrying 60 Rohingya Muslims escaping Myanmar capsized. 14 perished, most of them children. For the Bangladeshis, the mass influx of so many refugees is difficult to control. After a delay, these Rohingya Muslims should begin moving to an established refugee camp in the coming days. The border remains open, but for those still wanting to escape Myanmar, the fear is that soon the gates could shut. Tens of thousands are already massing on the frontier, ready to make their dash for survival.
Clive Myrie reporting from Cox's Bazar. Nelson Mandela's autobiography, The Long Walk to Freedom, has sold more than 14 million copies around the world since it was published over 20 years ago. And now, the second part has been launched in Johannesburg. It contains material that he left before he died, and the new memoir by South Africa's first democratically elected president was completed by his fellow countryman, Mandla Langa. Our correspondent Milton Nkosi reports from Johannesburg.
Dare Not Linger is the title of the book. Nelson Mandela, the last years of his life, he talked about it often, worried about work started, but not finished. Mandela spent 27 years in prison for fighting white minority rule. He became South Africa's first democratically elected president in 1994 and served only one term in office.
Milton Nkosi. You're listening to the newsroom on the BBC World Service. Stuart has the headlines.
President Trump has been embroiled in further controversy over his behaviour towards the grieving families of dead American soldiers. The US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson has set out his vision for a long-term strategic partnership with India, and German researchers have identified an alarming decline in the population of flying insects.
The clock is ticking for Catalonia's regional government to confirm whether or not it's going to break away from the rest of Spain. On Thursday morning, the Catalan leader, Carlos Puigdemont, must inform Madrid whether or not he will withdraw the declaration of independence that he made last week. This followed a referendum which the Spanish government said was illegal. From Barcelona, here's Tom Burridge.
If Catalonia's devolved government does not clearly state that it has not declared independence from Spain, then the Spanish government will make an unprecedented move. It will, for the first time ever, invoke broad constitutional powers. In reality, it will be a list of measures designed to exert direct control over the Catalan authorities. The focus will probably be on internal security, in particular Catalonia's own regional police force, which is managed by the regional government. For Madrid, this is about upholding the rule of law in Catalonia, protecting the Spanish constitution, and disciplining an unruly, disobedient, devolved government, which held an illegal referendum earlier this month. But Madrid will tread carefully. Civil servants and government lawyers have thought long and hard about what measures to adopt and when and how they should be implemented. The Spanish government wants to minimise the risk of large-scale demonstrations at what is a highly symbolic and sensitive moment in relations between Barcelona and Madrid.
Tom Burridge reporting. Argentines go to the polls this weekend, but campaigning was suspended on Wednesday after a body, thought to be that of a human rights activist, was found in a riverbed. Santiago Maldonado, who was 27, was last seen in Patagonia on the 1st of August when he was arrested at a protest. Since then, demonstrators in Buenos Aires have been calling on the authorities to answer questions about Mr. Maldonado's disappearance.
Well,
the government faces a test of its popularity on Sunday when there are midterm elections. It says there is no evidence that security forces held Mr. Maldonado, and it has denied claims of a cover-up. The case, though, has brought back memories of the 1970s and 80s, when thousands of people disappeared during a military dictatorship. I asked our correspondent in Buenos Aires, Daniel Pardo, what's known about Santiago Maldonado.
Well, he's a classic middle-class Argentine who's very into progressive ideas. He's from Buenos Aires, from the province of Buenos Aires, and he went to the south of the country to a protest of Mapuche indigenous because he agreed with the indigenous people that those territories belong to them, they are ancestral, and they should protest against those private companies who own most of the land in this huge, inhospitable land called the Patagonia in South Argentina.
And who's being blamed for his disappearance?
Well, obviously investigations are still going on, and in a case that has been so politicized, it's very difficult to know who's saying the truth. Most human rights organizations, the family and the Mapuche indigenous, believe that military who dispersed the protest were involved in his disappearance. All this is based on testimonies, on witnesses that are obviously politicized, that have a political idea of the whole conflict that has to do with a very old conflict between people who own land in the south part of the country and the Mapuche indigenous.
Of course, there's an election happening shortly. What's been the political reaction to all of this?
Well, Argentina is a very divided country. There's the government people who tend to be a right-wing view of the country and of politics. And from the start of this whole controversy, they supported the idea that maybe the Mapuches indigenous made him disappear in order to create this atmosphere that has been created, in fact. As a political kind of strategy. But all human rights organizations are also in this kind of political side. And they've maintained the idea that Maldonado was disappeared by the military who attacked the Mapuches during the protest, and that this is a case of someone who was disappeared by the state as it happened in the 70s and 80s. That's why this is so controversial, and this has become a main issue of the campaign.
Daniel Pardo. Stuart's here now with some other stories from our news desk.
A Brazilian congressional committee has voted to reject criminal charges brought against the president, Michel Temer. The charges stem from a corruption case involving the world's largest meat-packing firm, JBS. Mr. Temer can only face trial with the approval of two-thirds of the lower house of Congress and is expected to follow the congressional committee's lead when it votes on the charges next week. The Russian celebrity Ksenia Sobchak says she'll stand in next year's presidential election. There's intense speculation that the Kremlin wants her to run in order to provide a semblance of competition, but the Putin administration says it wasn't consulted over her decision. Ksenia Sobchak is a daughter of the late St. Petersburg mayor and mentor of Mr. Putin, Anatoly Sobchak. A Canadian man has filed a lawsuit against Sunwing Airlines for promising a champagne service and instead serving sparkling wine. Daniel McDuff's lawyer booked a holiday to Cuba through Sunwing that advertised a complimentary onboard champagne toast. The airline said it believes the lawsuit to be frivolous and without merit. Mr. McDuff's lawyer says the class action hinges on misleading marketing and not the quality of the wine served.
Well, let's stay in that region of the world because Quebec has adopted a law banning doctors, teachers and other public workers from wearing a full face veil. The bill will also mean Muslim women wearing a face covering would have to remove them on public transport. But it's not quite clear how it will be enforced. The newsroom's Jonathan Blake reports.
Despite its relatively anonymous title, Bill 62 has the potential to make a significant impact on public life in the Canadian province of Quebec. The legislation will require anyone working in or using a public service facility to remove any face covering. It'll apply to schools, universities, hospitals and public transport. The law does not specifically mention Islamic dress, but a small minority of Muslim women who wear the niqab or burqa, like Zainab Binrunsht, are concerned.
I take the bus maybe like 6 times every day because I go to the mall with my friends, I go out, I go to the library, so it will just make me stay home. Like, I don't have a car, I don't have anyone to drive me around, so it will just like block me from the rest of the world.
The law does allow for the possibility of people making a request for exemption on religious grounds, and Quebec's Justice Minister Stephanie Vallee insists it's not designed to target Muslims.
The guidelines are also there for the accommodation request, but the having your face uncovered is a legitimate question of communication, identification and security.
There have been previous attempts to ban people wearing conspicuous religious symbols such as the crucifix in Quebec. Those in support of this bill say it is largely to deter masked protests. But it's expected that the law will face a challenge in court, and bus drivers are among those already voicing concerns about how the law will be enforced.
Now, when a music icon passes away, it is not unusual for tributes to pour in, celebrating their contributions. What is unusual, though, is having the leader of a nation reduced to tears by the loss. That's exactly what happened in Canada today. Here's the Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, paying tribute to the lead singer from the band The Tragically Hip, Gord Downey.
Gord was my friend, but Gord was everyone's friend. It's who we were. Our buddy Gord, who loved this country with everything he had, and not just loved it in a nebulous, oh, I love Canada way. He loved every hidden corner, every story, every aspect of this country that he celebrated his whole life. And he wanted to make it better. And we are less as a country without Gord Downey in it. And we all knew it was coming. But we hoped it wasn't.
Well, the newsroom's Riley Carlson, Canadian herself, joins me now in the studio with more on this. Riley, just explain this to us, because it seems like Quite a big response from a musician that many people around the world will never have heard of.
It really does, and Gord Downie has been compared to a lot of people. He's Canada's Bruce Springsteen, he's Canada's Bob Dylan, although many Canadians will tell you he is distinctly Canadian, and none of those comparisons really go. The band, the Tragically Hip, represented something almost indescribable to a certain generation of Canadians. Abroad, Downie certainly did not have the name recognition of a Neil Young, a Celine Dion, or a Justin Bieber, but there was something about his songwriting that really resonated, and that's what the Prime Minister was really trying to touch on there, that Canadiana in the songwriting. This was an ingrained love of his country that came through. He would sing about small towns you will have never heard of. He sang about national court cases. He sang about hockey, of course, because he's Canadian. They've sold more albums in Canada than bands like U2. 9 of their albums have hit number 1 on the music charts in Canada, but they haven't broken the top 100 in the U.S. That's not to say they weren't successful there, though. They did tour. They appeared on Saturday Night Live, but they maintained a very strong presence at home and didn't really give off the impression that they cared to leave, instead finding their inspiration in Canada.
OK, reporting live, Riley Carlson. Tasmania, off the southern coast of Australia, is a treasure trove of rare and unusual animals. The trouble is, though, when animals are introduced onto islands like Tasmania, they can do huge damage to the native fauna. The critically endangered swift parrot is a case in point. It's under threat from small marsupials called sugar gliders in a battle for space in Australia's ancient forests. But scientists are helping out the beleaguered parrots with a simple but effective intervention, as Nick Miles reports.
That's a swift parrot as it emerges from its nest in a eucalyptus tree, shakes its red and yellow striped head from side to side and takes to the skies. They used to be widespread across Tasmania, but they've been declining since the 1980s. Now there are fewer than 1,000 of them left. Part of the problem is habitat destruction. Humans are cutting down the trees they breed in. But there's another villain here, introduced by man within the last 200 years. The big-eyed, fluffy-tailed sugar glider weighs in at about 1/10 of a kilogram. It hardly fits the bill of a carnivore, red in tooth and claw. But appearances are deceptive. It's nocturnal and hurls itself from tree to tree with an impressive gliding technique. It then raids the swift parrot nests.
Sugar gliders are introduced to Tasmania and are the main threat that faces swift parrots. In fact, swift parrots were listed as critically endangered entirely as a consequence of how severe sugar glider predation is on their nests.
Dejan Stojanovic is from the Australian National University. He says that in some breeding areas, no chicks are surviving the onslaught, but they're introducing a simple system to help the parrots survive.
To keep swift parrots safe from their main predator, the sugar glider, we've designed a device called the Possum Keeper Router. It's a mechanical door that opens and closes depending on the amount of daylight, and it will open in the daytime to allow the parrots to come in and out of their nests as they like, but at night time it'll shut and keep the sugar gliders out, but the parrots safe inside.
The doors are powered by solar panels, and they've got backup batteries as well. The research team set up a crowdfunding campaign to pay for them to be fitted onto 100 nest boxes that were already in the area. Early tests apparently worked well, and the birds weren't put off going into their nests by the machinery. As for the sugar gliders, well, they'll probably have to go and find prey elsewhere.
Nick Miles reporting. If you enjoyed the programme, you can find it again to listen to online. You can read more about the stories we've covered and others as well at bbc.com/news. You've been listening to The Newsroom from the BBC World Service with me, Ben Bland.
This is the BBC World Service, where we've been in the studio making a podcast.
Inspiration is for amateurs.
I want people's senses to be engaged.
This is magical. The podcast is called In the Studio.
How did you do this? What's real? What's not?
We're going to visit some of the world's great creative minds in their places of work. Okay, how do we make this thing?
It is a wonderfully chaotic place.
If I hit the keys, there's no sound.
I like things that defy gravity.
Just say the goddamn line. I think there's something very inspiring about being in a place where inspiration has struck.
It was a big eureka moment.
And I think if you want to understand a work of art better,
okay, scrap that idea.
Talking to the personal people who've created it in the spaces in which they've created it.
That is my grandfather clock.
Is a fantastic way in.
I think that's it.
In the studio. Subscribe now wherever you get your podcasts or go to bbcworldservice.com/in the studio.
During the process of giving birth, you're treading between life and death. All women know that.
I'm Julia Carneiro, a correspondent for BBC World Service. You're listening to the preparations for a C-section. C-sections involve cutting into the woman's uterus to deliver a baby surgically, but their excessive use in Brazil has been described as a C-section epidemic. Join me after the news to find out why.
BBC News with Stuart McIntosh. President Trump is at the centre of a deepening controversy over comments to a widow of a US soldier killed in action.